Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on these Generac GP Series Generators. The three here on the left come to us from my buddy Jason, and the one on the right actually comes to us from a subscriber, Jim. You know, all these machines, they appear to be physically in good shape. They all cost $100 and condition unknown. The one here on the left, it's actually missing the starter rope, so I don't know, if the engine rotates or not. The second one, this engine does rotate, and I assume the generator makes power, but I'm not sure of that. And this one, the GP 5000, it is missing the carburetor, part of the airbox, and more importantly, the engine, it is locked up solid. And then lastly, we have the GP 5500 from the subscriber Jim. This engine, I'm told, runs. It also rotates, but the generator doesn't make power. So we know for sure these two have some pretty serious issues, and I'm thinking we should start there. Let's validate, if this engine's any good or not, and also run some tests on the stator to see if it's truly bad. Because if these two are parts machines, then potentially we could combine the two to make one good. Or if we're really lucky, we can get both of them back up and running again. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. All right, so we're going to start with the Generac GP 5000. This is the one with the locked up engine. Let's see if it has any oil, and yeah, actually, that is nasty. Smells like fuel, and it's overfilled. So yeah, this one could be hydrolocked actually. The oil sensor is connected, so I don't think this engine blew. Let's get the spark plug out. See if we can get the engine to rotate. So this is actually a very good sign. I mean, there is a lot of fuel in that oil, and it's really old and smells pretty bad. So, that fuel could have only come from one place, which is the missing carburetor. So the needle and seat weren't working. The fuel valve was left on, and what happened was the carburetor flooded over, the fuel went down into the cylinder, and eventually made its way past the rings down into the engine, mixing with the oil. So if there's still some fuel in that cylinder, that could be the issue, because liquid, you can't compress. And that piston might be close to the top, top dead center, and it just can't push through that fluid. So we're going to pull the plug in a minute. First, though, I'm going to pull the tank and just get it out of the way. All right, now we have a lot better access to the plug. Ooh, and that is really stuck in there. All right, broke free, and seems to be rotating okay. And the plug that came out doesn't look too bad. There's no rust on it. It is a little bit wet and definitely smells like bad fuel. We've also got an NGK BPR 6ES, so a good name brand plug, and looks fairly new. So the question is, will the engine rotate? And the answer is no, it's still locked up. So yeah, they aren't looking too good for this engine. You know, the low oil sensor can only detect if there's low oil. It doesn't detect if the oil is diluted, which is the case here. So it is quite possible that the engine was run with the oil that's in there, and potentially, you know, the connecting rod is actually locked up on the crankshaft. So let's get a quick look in there with the borescope, see what we see. Then I'm thinking we should pull the starter recoil and see if we can rotate the engine backwards. All right, let's see what we can see here. All right, so we're looking straight down. That is the piston right there. And it actually looks pretty good. You can see a glimpse of the sidewall on your right. That also looks good. But I also see what looks like either rust or varnish right there. So, you know, this cylinder, it's not perfectly vertical or horizontal. It's kind of at an angle. So any fuel that comes in through the carburetor, it's going to go down on the lowest point of the cylinder, which is likely what we're seeing here on the right. And I'm guessing that is what's causing the piston to stick. So let me switch views here to the side camera. Let's see if we can get a better look at that. And yeah, so on your left, that is the piston. Kind of center your screen, that is the cylinder. It actually looks to be in very good shape. A little bit of loose carbon right there. If we rotate the other way, we can see the problem area. So yeah, that actually looks like varnish. You know, that was the old fuel that kind of washed down the cylinder, and it's now in the oil. So that is likely why the piston is stuck. So let's get some Marvel Mystery Oil in there. You know, we'll let it soak for a bit, and I'm willing to bet this engine will free up. I'm also going to spray some PB Blaster in there. Works really good for kind of cleaning up old oil and varnish. So I'm going to let that soak for maybe an hour, and then we'll try to break the engine free. All right, it's been sitting for an hour, so let's get a wrench on that flywheel nut, and we'll rock the engine back and forth. See if we can break it free. So we're going to rotate a little bit backwards, and it moved. Doesn't feel good, but at least it's not completely stuck. So let's just rock it back and forth until we get kind of through the problem area. I'm going to put a little bit more WD-40 in there. And there we go. Well, maybe not. We advanced a little bit, but now we're stuck again. And it really doesn't sound good in there. Not sure what that noise is. It sounds kind of crunchy. And there we go. So the engine, I still wouldn't say it spins free. You know, there is definitely some friction and a pretty bad smell of old fuel. So now that it rotates, I think we're going to drain the oil. We'll get some fresh oil in there, get some more oil in the cylinder, and then we're going to rotate this at high speed with a drill and see if we can't get it to rotate a little bit more freely. I'm not really liking what I'm seeing here. There's a lot of varnish on that dipstick, and same thing with the bolt. So I'm guessing the rest of the engine looks like that. In fact, I can see it just looking down there. So yeah, we're going to have to flush the oil a couple times. You know, this may not clean up. So yeah, let's see how bad it is. And yeah, it's pretty bad. So we can see, it looks like the camshaft gear kind of on your bottom right. I can see the counterweight, definitely some varnish and or rust. And if you look kind of on your top left, you can see a pretty clear varnish line. Now, the ball bearing thankfully is below, or above that, I should say. But there is a ton of varnish for sure in that engine. So yeah, not in great shape. You know, will it run again? Yes. How long? I'm not sure. Yeah, there's not a lot of good to say about this, except there is no metallic in the oil, you know, no engine glitter. So the engine hasn't blown up, at least not yet. You know, there is a lot of varnish in that engine, so I'm not sure how well it's going to run. You know, likely this engine will be condemned, but I'm thinking, you know, let's give it the benefit of the doubt. You know, let's get it running. Let's get some heat in the engine. We'll flush the oil, you know, see how the engine sounds, see if the generator works, and go from there. All right, just put a generous amount of penetrating oil down there. So say, let's turn this at speed, but the engine definitely not rotating well. You know, I can go backwards, and with one hand, you know, I can't really get through it. So yeah, we're gonna have to rotate this a bit and hope that we can clean things up. You know, even if by some miracle the bottom end comes around, you know, the rings might also be stuck. So yeah, I don't give this one good odds. Yeah, sounds a little rough. Let's rotate it slower. All right, let's try fast. Okay. Well, it does rotate better, but I didn't like the sound that the engine was making. It did seem like there was something grinding or rubbing in ways that it shouldn't. Let's spin it again at speed and see what it sounds like. Yeah, I don't like the sound of the engine. I don't hear a knocking, but it almost sounds like a bad ball bearing. But I do hear compression. And even rotating it by hand, right there, you know, I can feel kind of that noise, if that makes any sense. So yeah, this engine, it'll run. Like I can hear compression coming out, but I don't think it's going to run indefinitely. I'd say it only has a couple hours left before, well, the inevitable. So let's do a compression test. Let's see where it's at, or even before that, let's get the starter recoil back on, and then we'll get the compression tester hooked up. And maybe we'll just get the rest of this out of the way. So the carb that was on there had a fuel solenoid. And the interesting thing is that if you look over here, it's not actually attached to anything. So this carb was a replacement carb and not the original that was on the machine. So on a machine like this, there is a decompression system. So usually you see about 60 PSI, plus or minus 10 PSI. So anywhere between 50 and 70 is what I would expect to see on a healthy engine. So let's give it a couple pulls and see what we get on this one. Yeah, already over 30. 40. 50. And it looks like we topped out at about 52 PSI. So that's actually good. You know, that's what I'd expect to see on a healthy engine. So yeah, this should run, assuming we have spark, timing, and fuel, which obviously we don't have fuel. So let's come up with a carb and get it bolted on this machine. And as far as the carb goes, I have a lot to choose from, but I picked these two because this carb, I left myself a note that it runs well, but we are missing the choke plate and also the needle. So I'm going to steal those parts from this one, which is a brand new carburetor that just does not run well. So I've been using it as a parts carb. You can tell these are some used parts that have already been swapped out, but the choke plate is still good. And if the needle is still in here, we'll steal that as well and move it over to the carb that runs well, but is missing parts. So let's see if we can get that choke plate loose. Yep. All right, that plate should just come right out. And then to get the shaft out, we actually have to remove this lever on the top. There's just one screw holding it in place. And then that'll lift off. And then we should be able to remove the shaft from the parts carb. Okay, so I'm going to set that aside. And we're going to do the same with this one. And these are different brands, so there is a chance that that shaft does not fit. But what I find with Honda clone carbs is that most of the parts are interchangeable between different manufacturers. You know, even some of these parts can be swapped out with OEM Hondas without issue. So we'll set that aside. And this mechanism, it's a better mechanism in general because this one, it's plastic and it was essentially cut out in the middle. So it was slotted and you just slid the choke plate in and it kind of locked in place. The issue is sliding the choke plate in, stretched out the plastic and caused it to break. So this one being better quality, I don't think we'll have a repeat of that issue. And the shaft seems to be the same as far as the size goes. And I'm going to leave these screws loose for now. We might have to adjust kind of the position of that plate a little bit. You want to make sure it opens up and closes freely. And we're going to use this dark colored lever. You know, the yellow one was more of a Honeywell color. Yeah, that actually seems pretty good. So I'm going to lock it down right there. All right, so that problem is solved. Let's get a needle in here. Actually, there is a needle. So it doesn't look great, and we are missing the pin. The bolt on the bottom also not looking great. So I think we should swap these parts out with ones that are in better shape. So we get another parts carb here, and that looks a lot better. So, you know, this is not the main jet. This is just kind of the fuel pickup, and actually is similar to what you'd see on something like this with a solenoid. The difference is the solenoid one, it's drilled out in the center, and the solenoid actuates and actually blocks this opening. But on a carb like this, where there is no solenoid, you know, it just serves as the fuel pickup without, you know, that added feature. So that we will set aside. This we'll use, and I guess let's see what the needle looks like on this one. Looks pretty good actually in here. Float looks good. Pin's clean. And needle also good. So we're just going to move all this over. That's good. We'll use that bowl because that's the cleaner of the two. But we do need the gasket. And the gasket's not in great shape. It actually looks like it shrunk. So we got to stretch it out just long enough to get the bowl on. All right, that should do it. And before we can get the carb back on, we are actually missing the governor rod and the governor spring. So I do have some extra governor rods. The springs, not so sure. So we have 2 here, actually, and a spring. So these are different lengths. Let's grab the longer of the 2 and just put that in place. And it looks like it is going to align with the carburetor. Now, we might have to reset the calibration, but it looks like this is going to get us in the ballpark. So I did also see a spring that isn't perfect. You know, it's a little bit damaged right there, but that really shouldn't cause an issue. So we'll use this spring with that rod. And we'll double check the calibration. And then I think we'll be ready for contact. Now, technically, we could run this without the spring. The engine, though, likely isn't going to run well because without the spring, you know, there is play in that connection between the governor arm and the governor rod, so I can move those 2 parts, and there's a bit of slop in there. And the same is true, actually, on this connection on the carb side. So that little bit of slop can and will cause the engine to surge. You know, the governor just overreacts. So if you add a spring into the mix, what that is going to do is take out that slop. I mean, technically the slop is still there, but with the preload the spring puts on it, you know, that arm is now kind of preloaded on the right side of the hole, and it stays on that side. It doesn't shift to the left under normal conditions. So, yeah, that spring, definitely important. So I'm going to get the carb loosely in place. I'm just going to slide it all the way down the studs and move the throttle to the wide open throttle position. So against the set screw, that is idle, that is wide open throttle. And this spring should be holding the governor arm, which you probably can't see, but it's being held in wide open throttle. So if I push the arm to the left, you know, that's idle, and then the spring pulls it to the right. And when it stops, that's wide open throttle. So this bend should align with where it drops in right there. And you can see we're actually off quite a bit. So if we were to use this as is, you know, likely there wouldn't be enough throw in the governor to actually slow the engine all the way to a reasonable speed. So we are going to need to reset the governor to work with this rod. But before I do that, let me just check to see if there's any other rods in the bin that might be a little bit better fit. And the other 2 rods I have, they are shorter, and they're both shorter by the same amount. So yeah, these 2 definitely the wrong ones. You know, this one is the closest for sure. So let's get it installed. We'll do the governor reset. And then the governor should be able to control that engine speed. Yeah, I realized I didn't show it, but there's a gasket on the other side of the carb, so we should be good as far as that goes. We're also missing the nuts to hold the carb on, so I think they're just an M6 1.0, so let's try that. And yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I think it goes without saying, don't adjust the governor unless you're sure about kind of what you're doing here, because the slightest misadjustment and the engine's going to run at wide open throttle. So before you do anything, you want to make sure you know where idle is. In this case, you can look at the idle set screw, and when you move in such a way that the stop hits the idle set screw, you know that's idle. Another clue is that the spring pulls the throttle in the wide open position. So when I let go of the arm, the spring is going to move everything to wide open throttle. So now we are in wide open throttle. When going from idle to wide open throttle, we're turning counterclockwise. So that is something important you want to keep in mind. So we're going to hold the governor arm in place at wide open throttle. We're going to loosen this nut, and once we do that, we're then going to rotate this shaft counterclockwise until it stops. Then we tighten everything down, and the calibration's complete. And it's also worth noting there is a clip on this shaft. So when you loosen this, the shaft can't fall in the engine, but that clip, it can rust away. Somebody could have pulled it out. And if you loosen this and that's not in place, this could and will fall into the engine. Then you have a whole different set of problems. So let's crack this free. And we're loose. Sometimes you have to pry that open to get that shaft to rotate, but let's see if it'll move separately from the arm. And no, they're still locked together. So let's open that up a bit. Okay, now the shaft is moving independently of the arm. So again, you can hold this in the open throttle position. The spring's kind of doing that for us, so we could probably just rely on the spring. And if we lock it down right there, that should do it. All right, let's get the plug back in, add some fuel, and pull this thing over. And the fuel I'm using, it is a 50-to-1 mix. So it's really a 2-stroke mix, which generally don't recommend for 4 strokes. That can cause a lot of carbon buildup, can cause issues with scoring the cylinder. The valve's not sealing, but in this case, I think, the top end needs all the help it can get. So we are full of fuel, needle shut off. Let's try starting it. So we've got the light plugged in and turned on. The kilowatt is plugged in as well. And the one thing I noticed is that the hour counter on this machine actually works. Usually they go out at about the 10-year mark. The sad thing, though, is that according to the counter, there's only 19.9 hours of runtime. So yeah, this machine, practically brand new. So we'll turn the ignition on, choke is already on, and the light and the kilowatt are plugged in. So I'm pretty confident this will start, but I don't think it's going to sound that good. And likely we're going to see a lot of smoke because of the oil we put in the cylinder. What I really want to see here is that the light turns on, which means the generator is good. So let's see what happens here. Huh, nothing. Let's try it again. Yep, backfired out of the carburetor, so the valves, no surprise, aren't seating that well, but if we get it to run a little bit longer, I think that'll correct itself. Nope, let's try it again. And it's backfiring pretty bad, so let me actually move you over here. I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see a little fire on that carb. So I'm going to give it a little more fuel. You know, likely the intake isn't sealing that well because it is also varnished up, like we saw in the cylinder. So if we can get this to run just for a few seconds, I think, you know, that'll clean up. In the meantime, though, we're getting backfiring and some flame out of that intake. So let's try it again. It's trying. Or at least it was trying. Still have compression though. Let's try turning the choke back on. And no, it's not trying anymore. Yeah, no exhaust smoke at all. No fire out of the intake. So, you know, the carbon, don't think the issue's the carbon at this point. Maybe we lost spark, or maybe, you know, the plug just got flooded out. Oh, got a little kick that time. Let's do it with the choke open. And no, it's not going to start. So we need to pull it over, I would say, faster, or maybe just more. Huh. Let's try this a few more times here. I'm going to leave the choke open for now. And no signs of life. Let's choke it. And we got a backfire out the carb. And another backfire. Open that choke a little. Let's try all the way. And we'll close it. No. It's not going to start like this. All right, so the ignition, it is still on. Choke is open. Let's give it a few pulls like this. And no signs of life. Let's try it with the choke. Maybe a tiny bit open. Yeah, just popped out the intake. It's kind of surprising actually, because the leak down is minimal. You know, if I didn't know better, I'd say maybe timing is an issue. But it did run initially. So unless that flywheel just came out of time, I would say more likely we just have an intake valve with varnish on it that needs to be cleaned up a bit. And if the engine will start, you know, that'll clean up almost immediately. Try choke on all the way. Almost. Do choke open. And mostly closed. Now, doesn't want to start. All right, I caught my breath a little bit. Let's keep going here. Choke on. Choke off. And now that intake valve's just not sealing. So let's check the valves real quick. Make sure we don't have a clearance issue. I seriously doubt it's valves with just less than 20 hours on the machine. You know, likely it's that varnish. It's just on the valve seat, preventing a good seal. So even adjusting the valves right now may not be a good idea, because if there is some varnish holding the valve open a little bit, what we're going to see is that the clearance on the intake actually will be larger than it should be. And if that's the case, we'll leave it alone. You know, if it's tight for some reason, then yeah, valve adjustment will probably fix the issue. Yeah, I can tell you already, the intake definitely has some clearance. So let's rotate the engine a little bit. Exhaust is open. And yeah, there is a little bit of clearance. It actually does feel on the tight side. Let's double check that. And this valve, I believe it should be about 4/1000ths of an inch, plus or minus 1/1000. So we'll start with the 4. Yeah, and that fits right in there. And a 5 actually is tight. So the intake valve is perfect. Let's check the exhaust. That should be at 6. And we're not backfiring out of the exhaust, so I don't think we're going to have an issue there. The 6 fits. Actually, that's a 5. And the 6, let's not double that. Yeah, a 6 fits on the exhaust, so a little on the snug side, but the valves, they're fine. We don't need to adjust them. All right, let's try this one more time. We know the valves are good. I just pulled the plug again, rotated the engine for about a minute, hoping that it cleared the valve debris enough to get this to fire up long enough to know if we have a good generator here. Oh, almost. And now we're back to backfiring. We're going to try this a few more times. You know, this, technically we don't have to get it to run. You know, to get it to run consistently, we probably need to pull the head and lap the valve in. But, you know, given the state of the inside of that engine, I really hadn't planned on doing that. So for fun, let's just try a few more times to get this engine to start. not going to start. So we know the clearance is good, but it continues to pop out of the intake. So there is another possibility. I mean, timing could certainly be an issue, but it did kind of run initially. So timing likely is on. The other thing to consider here too is that this is a waste spark system, meaning the plug sparks twice. Once at top dead center on the compression stroke and once on the exhaust stroke. So yeah, potentially it's igniting only on the top dead center of the exhaust stroke, which technically both valves are open and we would see fire coming out. Now, the other thing that's suspicious too is that this NGK plug, the color of the writing on NGK plugs are usually blue. So this one could be a counterfeit and potentially not sparking under compression, because when I pull the engine over manually, things actually feel really good. Like the compression feels good. So maybe it's just a bad plug. All right, so we are refueled, and to give this best chance possible, I'm going to turn this over at speed using this high torque drill. And we also have a clutch. So if the engine does happen to start, it's not going to rip the drill out of my hand. So let's try starting this again. Okay. Who would have guessed? The fake NGK is to blame. So yeah, this plug was not sparking under compression. It was only sparking during valve overlap or kind of the waste spark on this engine. So now that we have the OEM plug in there, this thing fired right up. The engine actually sounded pretty good. So yeah, it makes me wonder, was this the original problem with this machine? Was this machine neglected because it wouldn't run due to a bad spark plug? Likely this was pushed into the corner, the fuel went bad, the needle failed, and caused all the issues that we're seeing inside of that engine. But the good news is, the engine runs, sounds good, the generator's making power, but we were smoking quite a bit, which isn't unexpected, but I had to shut it down due to carbon monoxide. So let's actually get this outside. I want to run it for a good 15-20 minutes, see if that smoke clears, and then we'll bring it back in, flush the oil, and assess kind of where the engine's at. All right, so let's get this thing running again. This time we're plumbed into external fuel. No two-stroke oil this time. It is just straight fuel. So that'll give the exhaust kind of the best chance possible to burn off any oil that might be in there. So the manual recoil is back on. Now that we have a good plug, it should start without putting up too much of a fight. And once running, I am going to put a fairly light 1500 watt load on to help build some heat in the engine as well as the exhaust. One thing worth noting too is that the engine speed was a little fast. I noted about 63 Hertz when we had it running, so I'm going to bring that down just a bit before leaving it to burn off the oil. So we've got the information we need. The generator we know is good. The engine can handle a 3,000 watt load, and actually the smoke cleared up pretty fast. So the top end on this engine, I would say, actually is decent. The bottom end, I'm not quite so sure of, given what we saw inside. We are also leaking oil, it would appear, from the crankcase cover. So at a minimum, we'd have to go in and replace that. But I'm not so sure that this one is worth it. Though the top end sounds good, I don't hear any rod knock. The bottom end doesn't sound great. It almost sounds like we have a bad ball bearing, or potentially the gears are bad, because the bottom end, it is making a lot of noise, kind of like a grinding noise. So yeah, this engine, I would say, is a parts engine. But let's just drain the oil, see how that brand new oil looks after about 8 minutes of running. Yeah, not good. I can actually hear particles hitting the pan, like hard pieces of something. And there is discoloration already in that oil. It doesn't look great. Let's see if the dipstick cleaned up or the threads. And no. Looks the same. And I think just for an experiment here, I'm going to fill the engine back up with diesel. I soaked the bolt for about 10-15 minutes in gasoline, and it really had no effect on the varnish on the end of that bolt. But I did the same with the dipstick and some diesel, and just the tip of it was soaking. You can kind of see it is making progress, at least on this side. The other side still coated in varnish, but yeah, the fact that it's making some progress, you can even see it on the glove coming off, is a good sign. And these chunks here are what kind of broke off from the dipstick, just bits of varnish. And I think that's what I heard, hitting the pan as the oil was coming out, was, bigger chunks of varnish coming out of the engine. So, the damage, it is already done, but it would be interesting to see, what diesel will do if we let this sit for a day or so. So I siphoned out the oil, and you can kind of see a lot of the solids that are left behind. So yeah, just running it with fresh oil definitely helped clean some of the stuff out. And up there, those are the chunks that I heard falling into the pan. So those are just chunks of varnish or bad oil. So yeah, running it with clean oil definitely helped flush it out. But yeah, there's a lot more to go. So it's actually the next morning, and the diesel's been in there for about 12 hours. We're going to let it sit, I would say, at least another 12, maybe a few days. So let's turn our attention to this machine, the one that Jim dropped off. He says it runs and doesn't make power. So let's try to start it and validate the complaint. So before we start this one, let's check the oil. Hopefully it's in better shape than the last machine. And, well, the dipstick looks pretty much the same. It is covered in varnish. Oil, though, does not smell like fuel. So this one, yeah, might be a little better. But now I'm concerned that this engine might have similar issues. So let's actually drain the oil and take a peek in there before we start it. Yeah, and very similar story here on the plug. It is covered in varnish. So very interesting. We might have two engines that are not blown up, but not well taken care of. All right, oil still draining out, but I've got to know. Hopefully this engine's in better shape. And yeah, actually, cam gear looks pretty decent, way better than the other machine. See if we can get a look at the crankshaft. And yeah, I mean, definitely some varnish, some sludge, but the connecting rod, crankshaft, you can see the cam there as well. That all looks a lot better than the other engines. So not ideal, but this engine, I think, still has a chance with a bit of proper maintenance. All right, let's try this out. Ignition's on, fuel is on, choke is on. We've also got a light plugged in and turned on and the kilowatt. So let's pull it over and see what we get here. And we get nothing. So yeah, confirmed, there is no output from the generator. But on the good news side, the engine actually sounds pretty good. You know, it started first pull, don't hear any knocking, don't hear any bad bearings inside of that engine. So although it's not great inside, you know, I think with a bit of maintenance, this engine can be made to last quite a bit longer. You know, as far as the generator goes, you know, if we're lucky, it's something simple like a bad set of brushes or maybe a wiring issue. But in this case, I'm going to cut to the chase. You know, pretty much every GP Series machine I've tested in the last 3 years that doesn't make power has a bad rotor. So let's get the end cover off. You know, we'll test through the brushes and see if that rotor is any good. So nothing obviously wrong. You know, the stator looks good. You know, there's no broken lacing, no burn marks. But I'm going to get this AVR out of the way just so we can get a little bit better look, and we'll get the wires off the brushes. And we'll test through the brushes. And stator definitely looks good, at least visually. Also no red flags here on the AVR. The capacitor looks good. Don't see any burn marks. You know, it doesn't mean the AVR can't be bad, but you kind of have to prove that everything else is good before just throwing a new AVR on there. Anyway, let's get some leads on the brush terminals and see what we get. So we're just going to set this to test resistance, and we're going to go right through the brushes. Now, if this does come back open circuit, you know, potentially the brushes failed. So we need to check, well, both the brushes and direct on the slip rings. But yeah, in this case, we are open circuit. So, you know, most likely the rotor's bad, but let's pull the brushes and make sure. And visually, brushes look good. Let's just make sure. Yep, that brush is good. Do the same to the other. We should see a nice low number. And yeah, both brushes test well, so that really only leaves the rotor. So we're just going to go direct to the slip rings. And yeah, rotor, it's open circuit. Likely we have a bad solder joint or a broken wire. So yeah, no surprise, we have a bad rotor on this Generac. So seems to be the common theme with these when they stop making power. You know, we could technically repair it, potentially, you know, if we can find that break. But I did speak to the owner, and his preference is to not try and repair it. He'd rather replace it with a brand new one or one that was never broken. So, you know, with that in mind, we could go to Generac and buy a new rotor. The issue is they don't sell just the rotor. You have to buy the entire generator assembly, including the stator. And, you know, that part, I'm not even sure if it's available anymore, but when it was well over $800. And this machine, it is not worth that much. So that is not really an option. You know, technically we could combine this with the other one over here and definitely make one good machine. The problem is these are owned by different people, and I'm not sure that is a viable option either. So instead, you know, we decided to move ahead with a brand new stator and rotor from Ryobi. This is a complete set, has everything we need, and it only cost $150. So we're going to get that installed on this machine, but that doesn't help us with the one that has the bad engine. So, you know, technically we could try to rebuild it, but I think a lot of parts in there need to be replaced. And again, cost is going to be a factor. So this engine might be better served as a parts machine. Not to mention, I do have other engines, and one of them is actually on this frame right over there. That one we rebuilt on video about a year ago, and it's ready to go, essentially brand new inside. So I think what we're going to do is use that engine and replace the bad. The complication, though, is that the replacement engine has a Hemi head, and because of that, the exhaust pipe needs to be a different length. So we're going to have to modify some stuff there, but you know, I think that is probably the approach we're going to take with this machine. So let's get the generator off of this one. We'll put on the new part, test it out real quick, and then we'll shift gears back to the other that has the bad engine. So we're going to get all these wires running up to the control panel disconnected, but just take note of kind of what things are before you disconnect it. So in this case, the wire colors seem to make sense. We have two white wires connected on either end here, which also run into two white wires. So that likely is the neutral. Then we got leg 1 and leg 2, which is the red and the gray. Now, the replacement stator might have different colors. And actually, the stator might not have 4 wires. It might have 3. You know, sometimes they common up the neutral in the internal wiring. So if that's the case, we'll have to combine the neutrals onto that single post. So these wires just held on by these nuts. So we'll get all those out. And that insulation on that stator, also not good. You can see how far down it's coming onto the ring terminal. So when you clamp this down, you know, that's essentially an insulator between these two ring terminals, which can cause problems. So you might want to check that. I see that a lot on different machines. So let's cut this zip tie out. And we've got one more wire there. That is the ground wire. And a lot of times too, this is where you'd see the connection between neutral and ground. You know, if it's a bonded machine, you know, in this case, I don't see the connection down here. Likely it's in the control panel. But if we test the white wires and the green wire, they're probably all connected, like the same circuit. So let's test that real quick. So we use the multimeter again, just set to test continuity, and we'll test from the ground wire to one of the whites. Yep. And yep. So these are the neutral, and it is bonded to ground. So we can set that aside. These wires I'm going to put back where they were and put the hardware back so we don't lose it. And then we're going to pull these bolts right here. We need to move this block a little bit out of the way because eventually we're going to need a puller to separate the end housing from the ball bearing. And before we can pull the stator and the rotor off, we actually have to pull the exhaust off because it's mounted directly to the end housing on the stator. So we've got a few bolts here, also the two on the head. Then the exhaust should come right out of the way. And we'll just loosen these two up on the bracket. I don't think we actually need to remove it. That one was already loose. And before we pull the last two bolts on the exhaust, attaching it to the head, it's a lot easier if we pull this shield out of the way. So we've just got a couple bolts holding it in place. And actually, we do need to remove this bracket because it is blocking access to one of the stator bolts. And if you're really lucky, the stator will just slide off, but that is not the case most times. So you do need a puller, but you shouldn't have to pull very hard. If you do, you are going to break the end housing. So a lot of times you can actually do this by hand without a wrench. And if you're going to use a wrench, you shouldn't be building pressure. If you are, then the stator is stuck and you want to stop. Otherwise, you are going to break something. In this case, twisting it by hand, we're not moving. So we're going to twist very lightly here with the wrench. And it is coming out. Although, progress just stopped. So I'm just going to reset. Try it one more time. Yeah, it's coming off. And now that we have good access to the rotor, let's see if we can find the point of failure. And I think I already see it. Let me zoom in. This wire right here that bridges, this coil to the coil here on the right, I was going to say, appears to be broken right there, but maybe that's an illusion. No, it's broken right there. So yeah, this one, it is repairable, I think. We can snip off this connection right here. Actually, let's just leave it for now. See if we can untwist this and get a little bit of extra wire. Yep, plenty of wire. And let's do the same to the other side. Yeah, we have plenty of wire to work with here, so I might just do the repair while we're here. And then we'll have a good rotor for the next GP 5500 that comes in. So I am going to cut. Let me back you up a little bit. I'm going to cut this right here. So we have plenty of wire to work with here, and it is aluminum wire, so that complicates things. I actually haven't ordered anything yet that would allow me to solder aluminum wire. And, the color, kind of indicates that this might be copper clad, but I don't think that is the case. Otherwise, I could solder it. This is just varnish, which is insulation. So it electrically insulates these wires. So even though they're touching, there's no circuit. So what we have to do is we have to remove that insulation before we can connect these wires together. And the easiest way to do that is to actually burn it off and then scrape kind of what's left. And then we should have clean wire. We can twist it together. If you can solder the aluminum, then you could solder it at that point. In my case, I'm going to crimp these together, and then we'll use some JB Weld to glue it to the stator. And that should be a good physical repair. So the complicated part here is just burning this off in such a way that we don't burn anything we don't want to. So I'm going to tilt that wire away. Do the same on the other side. That should be enough. We don't want to melt the wire. We'll do the same here. And that should be good enough. So the only thing I'm debating here is whether I want to re-anchor these to these posts. You know, being that we're going to glue it down here now, we don't necessarily need these posts to hold the wire still. But in this case, you know, that wire seems to be kind of glued on, so I don't think we can do anything about that. And kind of same thing on the other side. So I'm going to trim the tips. It looks like I melted them just a tiny bit. Other one's actually okay. And now we'll twist these together, and then we'll check on the slip rings, see if the issue is resolved. All right, we got a nice clean spot on the slip rings. Most of these rotors come in between 40 and 70 ohms. Let's see where this one's at. Yeah, not bad. We're at 81. So technically a little bit higher than I normally see. But it will absolutely work at 81. So yeah, this rotor I think can be salvaged. So I'm going to add a mechanical connection right there. We'll tuck the wires in close to the plastic here and just glue them in place so that we don't have any vibration ripping them apart, which is likely what caused the failure the first time. So we now have a great mechanical connection here. So I'm going to rough up this surface down here, clean it up with a bit of rubbing alcohol. We'll tuck these wires as close as we can and get some likely JB weld or potentially plastic weld in there to cement these in place. And I am going to speak to the owner again. Just make sure he wants a new stator and rotor because, you know, the engine, it is not perfect on this machine. So is it worth putting $150 in parts in it? I'm not sure. So it is about 12 hours later, and the JB Weld, it is dry, although not fully cured. So we're going to have to give that a little bit more time before trying it out. And I also added a similar blob here on the other side, just to help with the balance. Anyway, as far as how to proceed, the owner didn't want this repaired. He thought this machine was in excellent condition, at least as far as the engine goes, and wanted to make the generator side perfect as well. But now, knowing what we know, he's not so anxious to spend the money to make the generator side perfect, knowing that the engine was not well maintained. So he is fine running with the repaired rotor. So let's get the slip rings cleaned up. While this is drying, we can at least get it fully back together. And then tomorrow, we'll fire the engine up and see if this thing makes power. And before we put the stator bolts on and torque things down, we actually want to set this down on the mounts because, technically this end housing can be crooked, which actually it looks like this side is lower than that side. And when we set it down, that'll make it very clear, and we want to straighten it out. And that way, this hole here, which is the stator bolt hole, will align properly with the one on the far side. And it's probably hard to see from your angle, but this foot is sitting down, whereas the one over here, there is a gap. So we need to tap the end housing probably right here to get things to rotate and align a little better. And that's it. So we're aligned. Going to get the bolts loosely in. We'll snug them up a bit. And then we'll torque the stator down. So before we get too far reconnecting wires here, I'm actually going to pull the spark plug. We need to rotate the engine and just make sure that, the stator and rotor alignment is good and that there is no binding. Because if it binds, you're going to destroy the rotor and stator. And it's really kind of a waste of time to do all the wiring just to find out you have a problem down here. And we'll probably get this plug replaced as well. Even though it's running the engine currently, it is a no-name plug. And we'd have much better luck, I think, with an NGK long term. So you can use the recoil to rotate the engine or the rotor bolt. And it is spinning nice and free. I don't hear any scraping. There's no binding. So I think we're good, as far as the alignment goes. And honestly, I don't even think this stuff is needed. When this is on the terminal block, we have these plastic separators right here. If this tubing wasn't here, I guess you would have a conductor probably right to about there. So technically, this is, I guess, making things more safe. But you don't want to actually insulate the connection up to the control panel. This ring terminal has to make contact with the ring terminal for the control panel. So yeah, we can actually pull that back. So maybe I'll do that instead. We'll pull them back and then kind of leave it like that. And we'll see if we can do the same on the others. The other thing I find odd too, these eyelets they use, they're just pretty oversized for this terminal block. Whereas you look at the control panel eyelets, they're a much better fit. So yeah, I don't know why they do this. Actually, most generators have these oversized eyelets down coming out of the stator, whereas the ones that run up to the control panel are the proper size. Okay, those look a lot better. So now we can get the brushes and the AVR reinstalled. And that'll pretty much do it, at least for the electrical side of things, until the JB Weld is fully cured. So the last thing really would be to get the exhaust on. Then we can try it out in the morning. So for now, we're going to leave this bracket on loose because these holes are slotted. So once we get the exhaust bolted on, we can then tighten these down. All right, this one, we've taken it as far as we can for now. We need to give it another 12 hours or so for that JB weld to cure. So let's turn our attention back to this one. This one has been marinating in diesel for almost 24 hours. So let's pull the drain plug and see if anything washes out of there. And no, not much washed out of that engine. So, I was hoping it would take the varnish off. Yeah, I think it did loosen it up a bit. As you can see, it is coming off the dipstick. So I'm thinking we should refill this with oil, maybe dilute it with a bit of diesel, run this for another 5 minutes or so, flush the oil, and then we'll take a look in there at the camera and see if anything has improved. Yeah, maybe I was a little too quick to say the diesel did nothing because, I just filtered this diesel, so all the chunks are out of it, and you can see it is pretty dark in color. So clearly it was removing deposits from that engine. Anyway, what I'm going to do now, not recommended, it's really a last-ditch effort to try to save an engine. Obviously, running an engine diluted on diesel, not good for the engine. It's going to cause accelerated wear. But in the condition that it's in now, I think this qualifies as a last-ditch effort. So I'm going to put probably about 350 milliliters of diesel in, and then we'll top the rest off with oil, run it for a few minutes at reduced speed, and then we'll flush the oil again. So I'm going to back this spring tension off quite a bit. I think we more or less want it to idle. And doing this, there is a pretty high risk that we're going to finish this engine off if we're not careful. And the concentration of diesel I put in was a little bit more than, I was thinking. We're probably closer to 50-50. But like this, diesel, it is a solvent and it is a lubricant, but obviously not adequate for running an engine for any period of time. So I'm thinking maybe we dial back the runtime from what I was thinking to closer to, 2 or 3 minutes and hope that the engine survives. So we ran it for 3.5 minutes. The engine survived. So let's pull the plug, see if we can get any more of that junk out of there. So clearly the diesel, it is helping, but I think it's too late likely for this engine. So let's just see what it looks like now versus last time we looked. And yeah, not good. So that is actually the counterbalance shaft, and it is covered in varnish, maybe rust as well. If we go in a little deeper, you can see still have some very significant staining and buildup kind of in the sump. And if we pan back toward the crankshaft, let's see if we can get a better view of that. Yeah, kind of the same story, although we can see the lobes on the cam. That doesn't look too bad. And the crankshaft, honestly, isn't terrible. So, yeah, I mean, this engine, could it be saved? I would say yes. You know, at least there's not a hole in the block. But, you know, the buildup here, it is pretty significant. But I would say we are making progress. It does look better than when we started. You know, that said, though, I am going to call it. You know, I don't like the way the ball bearings sound in this engine. And we could replace them, but, you know, given what we have to work with here, you know, I think this is better served as a parts machine. All right, we've got both patients up here on the lift, the donor on the right and the recipient on the left. So the donor doesn't have the stator installed, so this should be fairly easy to pull the engine and move it over. This one, though, we do have to remove the generator first, as well as the exhaust. You know, we can do the engine swap, and then the GP 5000 should be good to go. And the first few steps here, it's pretty much the same thing that we did on the other machine that had the bad rotor. We need to, you know, pull out the brushes, the AVR, disconnect the wires, remove the exhaust and the stator. And then at that point, we'll just have the rotor left. We'll get that off, and then we'll be in a position to swap the engine over. So I'm not sure how much I'm going to show of this in detail since we just saw it. So I might skip a few parts or zip through some others, like this one. It'll be interesting to see if we actually have a blown oil seal. You know, I thought it was coming from the cover, but I'm not so sure because when I pulled the end cap off the generator, there is some oil down there as well. So yeah, potentially some of that oil got into the stator. So we're going to get this threaded most of the way back in. And what I'm going to try is just striking this bolt with a 3-pound hammer a couple times. And that shock should release the rotor, with any luck, from the tapered shaft. Now, the one thing you do have to watch out for is, well, your aim. If you miss, you're going to hit the rotor, and the rotor will no longer be good. think that popped it off. And just 2 more bolts for the engine mounts. So once these are removed, we can lift this bad engine off and we'll set it off to the side. I do want to kind of revisit this. We'll at least take the sump cover off and have a better look at all the buildup inside the engine. Interesting. So this bracket, it helps hold or support the airbox, and it doesn't fit on this engine. And that's because the blower housing, it's a different shape due to the Hemi head. So we might have to modify this a bit, but we'll come back to that later. We don't even have an airbox for this. We're going to steal eventually the airbox from the bad engine. One of the worst things about digital torque wrenches is that they shut off. So I've been caught a few times torquing bolts down and it actually shut off. Not good. So now that the stator is seated in the bell housing, I'm going to set it down on the mounts. I want to make sure that we're nice and level. And once that is good, we'll add the stator bolts and torque them down. That looks pretty good, actually. So at this point, the rotor and stator, they are installed and theoretically good, but you want to double check that. So I did pull the spark plug out, and I'm just going to rotate the engine, make sure that, the rotor is not scraping on the stator, that there's no binding. And in this case, everything seems to spin fine. So let's get the wires reconnected and finish this up. And we get the wires plugged into the brushes, red on the left. Which reminds me, I kind of wanted to clean the slip rings before, getting the stator back on, but I kind of forgot about it. So, it should be fine. They actually weren't that dirty. But it's a lot easier to do when the stator is off the machine. All right, and that's it. The wiring's done, so next time this runs, we should have power up at the control panel. So that leaves the exhaust. I'm going to leave the end cover off for now until I know everything is good. And for the exhaust, I'm going to use the exhaust that was on the test machine. Or I should say the test stand with the test engine. I think that is the right length, but it's not my first choice. I'll show you why. And this is the exhaust I'm talking about. This pipe, it's a little bit shorter and should accommodate the Hemi head. The issue is this exhaust also has a heat shield built in, and we really don't need that. This particular machine has a heat shield right there. So, ideally I would use one of these which doesn't have the heat shield built in and save this for something else. So I might have one in the storage locker with a shorter pipe, but I'm thinking, even so, maybe we give this one a try. I mean, worst case, it's going to extend a little bit past the engine mount, and if we just use a spacer and a longer bolt, likely this should fit. So let's try that first. So we'll get the mount back on. But I'm going to leave these bolts loose because there is some adjustment in there. So once the exhaust is actually bolted on, we'll circle back and tighten up the bracket bolts. And actually, now that I'm looking at the bracket too, we might have other options here. Usually I put the spacer between the bracket and the exhaust bracket, but there is actually another hole here on the top. Potentially for this occasion. We were using this hole, but if we use that one, it's going to kick the bracket out just a bit. We're still going to need a spacer back here, but now it's behind the bracket. So I'm not really sure it makes a difference, but let's try this and see if this gets us close to where we need to be. Yeah, that's pretty much perfect. So using that other hole kicked the bracket out to the exact length we need. Now we still need a spacer down here. So I'm not sure there's any huge benefit, but it is interesting that the bracket already has accommodations to kind of switch between a standard head and a Hemi head. So we're going to swap out this short M8 1.25 for one that's a little bit longer. And this nut is the perfect size to act as the spacer. So we just need to drive this in. And it might potentially be too long, this other bolt, but we'll try it. Oh, that is perfect. And we're just about there. So the last big thing here was just adding the airbox. And actually this carburetor needs the same repair to the choke plate that we did over here. That said though, I found a bigger problem. This carburetor, it was run through the ultrasonic about a year ago. It ran this engine absolutely perfect. I drained the bowl, stored it, and now a year later, that throttle plate is locked up. Solid. Like, it does not move at all. So we don't want to start it like that because the engine's going to run wide open and potentially self-destruct. So let's get the carb off, see if we can free it up. Otherwise we might swap this one for the one over there. And if the throttle plate doesn't move, it's actually going to be pretty hard to get off of here because that has to rotate as you pull this forward, to unlock the governor rod. So we're going to get some of the good stuff in here and see if we can get it to move. Huh. Yeah, it's not really moving, although it is flexing. Yeah, it moves, but not well. That should spring back. And it's not. So yeah, makes me wonder what happened to this. You know, what solution did I use in the ultrasonic? Because I might not want to use that again. That's pretty bad, but it does move. Yeah, it doesn't look good in there. You can see there is some corrosion. And the more concerning thing is what's going on here. You know, I thought we started to free it up. You know, right now that is idle. That is wide open throttle. But if you look at the throttle plate, that is wide open. So if we rotate this to idle, that plate should close. And it doesn't. You know, it is locked up solid. You know, this plastic piece no longer connected properly to that throttle shaft. So this carb, despite being a good carb last time I used it, it's no longer good. And let's just take this a step further. I want to see what the inside looks like. You know, there was some corrosion in the throat. Not a lot. And this carb too, I double checked the rebuild video. I wanted to see what cleaner I used in the ultrasonic. And this carb actually was clean. I did not run it through the ultrasonic. Yeah, the inside looks spotless. Don't see any issues here. So really, the problem is the throttle plate and the choke to a lesser extent. So, you know, likely we are going to use the other carb we rebuilt or fixed earlier. But let me look around. I want to see if I have another parts carb that has the parts we need. And if I do, I'd rather move those parts over because I knew this carb did run quite well. All right, I did come up with a carb that is more or less the same, but it is a different manufacturer. So I don't know for sure if the parts are 100% compatible. But this one does have a working throttle plate as well as a choke. So we could move these parts over to fix this one. I guess what I'm wondering is, would it be better to just give this one a try since we don't know if it works? But yeah, that bowl nut has a bunch of rust, and actually the bowl seal for the nut is damaged. Bowl itself, a little bit of corrosion, not too bad. We are missing the pin, and needle doesn't look great. But the rest of the carb, though, actually appears to be in very good condition. So I'm thinking it might actually be easier to steal the good parts from here because we know the bowl is good, the bowl nut, the float, the needle. So yeah, let's actually move those parts over to this unknown carb that has the orange choke lever. So likely it was on a Generac engine of the same type. And we'll try it out. I also did double check the jets, both the pilot and the main, they are clear. But this brand SP, I want to say I've had issues with these in the past running lean. So if this one gives us any trouble at all, probably just going to swap it out. I'm using some two-stroke oil. You know, this engine hasn't been run in a year, and that little bit of extra oil won't hurt the top end, at least for testing. Plus, it's what I had in the bottle, so we're going to use it up. And it looks like needle and seat are working. So that fuel still advancing really slowly into the car, but I think as it fills up, you know, that should shut off completely. So, you know, let's pull the engine over, see if we can get it started. Now, the spring tension, it is backed off. After the rebuild, I did bring it back. So it's probably going to be closer to 50 Hertz. So once it's running, we'll adjust that up to about 61.5. All right, it is the moment of truth. Will the engine start after sitting for a year? Will this mystery carb run it well? And more importantly, did I put everything together properly? Guess we'll find out. So, choke is on. How many pulls? And that's it. So we have now a good engine with a good carburetor and a good generator. So the tank, I didn't show you that, but it is spotless inside, which is kind of hard to believe given the condition of that engine. Anyway, the engine speed, it was slow. We're now up to 61.5 Hertz, and it looks like everything is good from the engine to the generator. So let's get the end cover back on the generator. We'll resecure the tank. And then we're going to get this off the lift. You know, it is ready for testing, and that just leaves the other one over here. You know, it's been over 24 hours, so that JB weld is cured. So I say we get that up on the lift, start it up, and see if we can go 2 for 2. So what do you think? Can we go 2 for 2? I think so. We know the engine runs, the carburetor runs it pretty well. The big question is, are we going to have power this time? And based on the testing and what we saw, it was due to a broken wire in the rotor. So now that that's repaired, we should make power. So we've got a light plugged in and turned on, as well as the kilowatt. Carb is fueled up and ready to go. So let's pull it over and see what we get. All right, JB Weld for the win. This is now making power again, and pretty much perfectly. We were at 122 volts, about 60 hertz. That said, though, the no-load speed does need to be a little faster, so I did tweak it closer to 61.5 hertz, and now this machine is more or less perfect. So in theory, we now have 2 good generators, and when we started, we didn't have any. That might be declaring victory a little bit too fast, though. So we do still need to load test it. So let's finish getting this together. We'll get both of them outside and put them to the test. And before we get the tank back on, I am going to replace the fuel line. This line's not in terrible shape, but I'm not a big fan of this filter. It's actually on backwards. It's a paper filter, and you don't want that on a gravity-fed system. Not to mention, these worm drive clamps aren't great. And even if we eliminate this, we still have 2 filters in the tank. One is the pre-filter where you fill the fuel in, and the other one's at the fuel valve, and that's all most Hondas and Honda clones use. So eliminating this shouldn't hurt anything. And before we get the tank back on, I do want to drain it. There is some fuel in here. The inside of the tank, not bad. I'll show you that in a minute. The bottom actually is spotless. I think there is some surface rust on the top of the tank. But, as far as tanks go, this one really isn't that bad. But the fuel is an unknown. You can see there is some rust or some junk being held back by that filter. So yeah, best to get that out of the system while the tank's off the machine. And we'll also clean off this filter. Fuel that came out too was definitely old, but it wasn't bad. But it was kind of living on borrowed time. And the fuel, again, not terrible. No water in the fuel, but it's definitely been in there, I would say, for a couple years. And the tank, you can kind of get a look at what the tank looks like. Not too bad. just a bit of surface rust up here, and you can see a little corrosion on the cap. But overall, not too bad. And that just leaves us with the bad engine. So I do want to get the cover off and just have a look at how bad it really is. My big concern was the bearing noise that I heard, and also looking in there with the borescope, I saw chunks of what I assume is varnish, and that will definitely cause engine damage. So before we get this cover off, I'm going to double check the cover bolt torque. You can see kind of where the oil was leaking. I think it was coming from up here. So I don't have the specs for this exact Honda clone, but according to the Rotor Honda clone manual, this cover should be tightened to about 28 Newton meters, or just over 20 foot-pounds. So we'll double check the bolts. Before we can do that, we actually have to remove this cover so that we can get the torque wrench on the ones over here on the bottom right. So we're set to 20 foot-pounds, and technically this should be a little more than that, right? 28 Newton meters I think is more like 20 and a half. So these shouldn't turn. And that one is good. That one's also good. Yeah, so far they're all good, which makes me wonder why it was leaking oil. I mean, potentially the gasket's just bad. That's good. And that's pretty much it for the bolts on the right. And that's where the leak is coming from. But let's just check the rest. Good. And good. So yeah, no issues with the bolt torque. Must be a bad gasket or potentially something wrong with the case. All right, the seal is broken here on the left. and also on the right. So now it's time for the big reveal. Yeah, and it's pretty bad. Just the smell is not good. And the problem, I didn't think went up to the bearings. At least on the far side, it didn't look like it. But on this side, clearly, the entire cover saw the bad fuel. This bearing doesn't look great. A little bit crunchy, but not terrible. Although I say that, it just locked up a little bit. So yeah, that bearing for sure is not good. This one here is for the counterbalance shaft, and this one is extremely crunchy. So yeah, that was likely the noise. Governor obviously still works, but it has some buildup on it. And the engine, not good. Let me get in there a little closer. So definitely some buildup here on the crank. Not worn, but you can see the kind of the ring of varnish right there. Let's try to get the camshaft out. And to do that, we need to rotate the engine. So let me pull the spark plug and make things a bit easier. Yeah, spark plug's out, and it's a little hard to turn over. Just going to line up those timing marks, that way there's no spring pressure on the lifters, so we can pull the cam out easier. Now when we remove this, the lifters are going to fall out most likely, push rods as well. But it's not actually coming out, so potentially it's stuck in the journal, if there's a lot of buildup there. Let's rotate the engine a little more. All right, and the cam is out. So, yeah, surprisingly, the lobes, well, besides being dirty, when I touch them, don't look bad. Decompression system not locked up. Journal, not great, but I can't feel that, so that technically is probably okay. And same thing over here. The teeth, also not as bad as I thought. I was thinking potentially the noise was just the teeth meshing with a lot of rust, but yeah, I don't see that. So yeah, not my first choice in parts to use, but this part I would say could be cleaned up and used. Let's take a look at the exhaust lifter. Yeah, not terrible. And the intake, this one's definitely worse. There is some buildup here. It's pretty crunchy and rough. And the bottom side, not as good. This area right here is rough. So the lifters, I would say, should not be reused. Push rod, looks like we can get it out through the bottom. Push rod looks okay. And the other push rod, not going to come out, so that's fine. Let's get the balance shaft out. And this one looks a lot worse than I thought. A lot of buildup on it. Yeah, journal is okay on both sides, so that could be cleaned up, potentially reused. The gear doesn't look great, and there's also a lot of that chunky material on here, so that would have to be cleaned off. All those little bits can break off and cause damage in the engine. So yeah, again, not great. Usable, technically yes, with a bit of work. The oil sensor, I would say, likely is not functional, so that would have to be replaced. And then down here, there's just tons of crunchy mud. It's probably the best way to describe it. Not what you want to see inside an engine. So, yeah, would that clean up? Yeah, I mean, the block might still be stained, but again, if you can get all the pieces out and not run an engine with these chunks in it, you know, it would be fine. You know, this just needs to hold oil. You know, as far as the bearings go, you know, the main crank one we can't check unless we pull the crank, but I'm probably going to leave that in there for now. But let's check the counterbalance bearing. And surprisingly, doesn't feel good. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Although this one looks better, likely it has some of those chunks in there. Although now that I'm spinning it, it's actually getting quite a bit better. So yeah, this bearing might not be shot, but if we ever did do a rebuild on this, we'd probably want to replace all of them just to be sure. Anyway, let's get the bolts off the cap here and take a look at the condition of the cap as well as the main journal. Cap looks pretty good. Just some minor superficial scoring, but I would say reusable. Let's take a look at the journal. And the main journal doesn't look as good as the connecting rod. You can see what looks like maybe the beginnings of some aluminum transfer from the connecting rod. So crankshaft, you know, I would say it's not shot, but like everything else on this engine, it's going to need a bit of work if it's going to be used again. Yeah, it's surprising actually, on the bottom, it is cleaning up pretty well. You know, I thought that stain would be impossible to get out of there. You know, I guess it's the stuff that's higher up and on the crankcase cover that might be a challenge, but carb cleaner seems to be cutting through it. Let's try the same here on the cover. Yeah, it's actually taking this sludge off. I mean, it's still going to have a stain, but this can absolutely be cleaned up. So if nothing else, I'd say there are a lot of good parts here with a little bit of elbow grease. All right, so it is the moment of truth. You know, both of these machines were not in great shape when we got them, despite their outer appearance. You know, this one, the internals of the engine were in pretty poor shape, so we put a rebuilt engine on it, although I use that term a little bit loosely. You know, in that video, we did open the engine, clean it up, but really left the internals alone. You know, the big issue was the head, and Generac did sell a new head for $400, but we instead ordered a $100 head from Amazon. So will this engine deliver enough horsepower to get to the rated load? You know, of that, I'm not sure, but I am fairly confident because this is an oversized engine. You know, theoretically, it should be able to handle 7,000 watts. So 5,000 watts should be a walk in the park. And then we have the machine over here, which also didn't look great inside, but not nearly as bad. And this engine actually still sounds healthy. But of course, the rotor is held together with JB Weld. So will it hold? I hope so. So let's start with this machine. We're going to get it started While it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt. We'll verify the voltage and the frequency. We'll use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion and the oscilloscope to see what the waveform looks like. Assuming everything checks out, we'll put on a half load, let that run for a while, and then we'll go for the max of 5,500 watts. All right, no issues at all getting the engine started. Now the engine speed, it was a little bit slow, but as the engine has warmed up, the engine speed has also come up pretty much to where we need it, at about 61.5 Hertz. So that is more or less perfect. Without a load, we're starting at about 9.1% THD, which isn't that bad. And the sine wave doesn't look great, but that should clean up a bit under load. So let's put on a 2,500 watt load, starting with 2,000 watts, and we'll add another 500. So no issues, although the engine speed did come down a lot, so we're gonna have to keep an eye on that. Without too much of a load, or actually a half load, we're at 13.9% THD. And the sine wave, it did clean up some. So let's give this a few minutes, and then we'll go for the max of 5,500 watts. And a couple minutes later, no issues at all pulling 2,500 watts. The voltage is pretty much perfect at 122 volts. The engine speed, not terrible. We're just below 59 Hertz, so I think we're going to be okay if we bring the load up. So let's do that. Let's bring it up to 3,000 watts, 4,000 watts. Engine speed definitely slowed more than I'd like. Let's try 4,500 watts, 5,000 watts. Yeah, that engine's really working for that 5,000 watts. Should we try 5,500? Yeah, it's doing it, but just barely. And that engine speed, I think, is too slow. So we'll double check that in a minute. Under full load, we're at 16.3% THD. And the sine wave looks about the same. So let's give this a few minutes. Potentially we might adjust the engine speed, but so far so good. All right, so the engine speed isn't great, and the voltage is actually a little bit high, so the two might be related. At 5,500 watts, close to 125 volts, we're actually pulling an overload, so that might be partially to blame. So let's take off 500 watts and see where that gets us. And yeah, we're at about 57 Hertz, so not ideal, but it is passable. So yeah, we might bring the engine speed up a little. Let's take the load off and just double check where the no load speed is at. And it's actually pretty high. That looks like 63 Hertz. No, actually only 62. But yeah, the engine speed, we're kind of maxed out. That's going to come down a little bit as the engine cools down. But as it is right now, I don't want to bring that any higher. So we'll take a look at the governor after we shut it down to make sure that, the spring is in the right spot. But if it is, not going to be a whole lot we can do. So let's give this a minute to cool down, and then we'll shut it down. So let's take a look here. Governor rod, it appears to be in the right spot. That should be in the outer position. And the governor spring might be a little bit harder to see, but that also is usually in the outer position. And this one is. So, technically we could move that spring in, and that would give us a little bit more sensitivity. But on these Honda clones, that spring is pretty much always on the outside. And I've tried moving it in and really haven't seen much of a difference as far as the sensitivity goes. So I don't think that's really going to get us a whole lot. I think the voltage at 125 volts, it is on the high side, but it's on the high side of okay. If we brought that down to 120, likely that engine speed would be closer to 57 Hertz. But, if given the choice, I'd rather have the voltage actually a little bit on the high side. And I think we're going to call this one good enough, although definitely not great. So let's roll this one out of the way. We'll get the other one in its place and see if that Amazon head can perform any better. Actually, on second thought, let's try a governor reset and see if that makes any improvement. If it does, great. If not, we're going to get it started again anyway and find out. And what I'd like to do is bump the throttle by hand to see if we're actually out of horsepower or if it's the governor holding the speed back. So don't do this unless you know what you're doing, because if you do this wrong, the engine's going to race out of control. So just be ready to shut it down. Even if you know what you're doing, sometimes you still do it wrong. So what you want to do here is just look at the spring and see which way it's pulling the governor shaft. In this case, counterclockwise. So that is wide open throttle. And you want to make sure that this shaft is rotated all the way counterclockwise before you lock this nut down. Now, it's only a fine adjustment. You may not even see the difference, but there is a difference. And technically, anytime you replace the carburetor, you're supposed to do this, but usually you don't have to. But yeah, I'm not feeling a difference between where it was and where it is. But let's tighten it up and just make sure. Okay, let's try that out. And without a load, we're at about 62 Hertz again, so let's load it up. And you can see that initial drop is pretty big, from no load to 2,000 watts. I mean, that's a good 2 Hertz right there, which is a lot. So 4,000 watts. So yeah, no change. Seems to be behaving like it did before we made that adjustment. So yeah, let's let it cool down. We'll shut it down and we'll get the GP 5000 in its place and see if that one does any better. And like the last machine, no issues at all getting it started. Now the voltage is a little bit lower, I think around 121, maybe 122 volts. And the engine speed also started slow, but as the engine is warmed up, we're now at 61.5, so that is pretty much perfect. Without a load, THD is actually better at about 6%. And the sine wave also maybe a tiny bit better. So let's start with a 2,000 watt load. No issues, and the initial engine speed drop not nearly as bad. I'd say about half of what the other machine was, so that right there might make the difference. Anyway, we're pulling 2,000 watts. Let's go for half load at 2,500. And engine speed is pretty good at about 60 Hertz, but the THD went up quite a bit. We're at 17.3%, and the sine wave, like the other, cleaned up some, but still not great. So let's give this a few minutes, and then we'll go for the max at 5,000 watts. And yeah, this engine definitely performing better than the last. You know, at 2,500 watts, we're pretty much at exactly 60 Hertz, and the voltage is holding steady. So I don't think we're going to have any issues getting to the rated load of 5,000 watts. So let's bring it up to 3,000, 4,000, and yeah, this is holding really steady. Although a slight oscillation, so that could be a problem. 4,500 watts, 5,000 watts, and yeah, we're at the rated. Now the engine speed is a little bit unsteady, but I wouldn't call that a surge, so I think we're going to be okay. THD did go up though again, we're now at 21.3, and the sine wave looks a little better, but still kind of distorted. So we'll give this a few minutes, and then we'll go for an overload and see how much this engine can handle. And yeah, this engine performing quite a bit better. So under 5,000 watts, we're at 60 Hertz, 122 volts. So the engine definitely has a lot more in it. You know, I have no doubt of that. I guess the question is, does the generator? You know, it is smaller than a GP 5500, and of course these circuit breakers, they're not really gonna like an overload. But you know, I say we go for it. So let's swap out these lighter loads. Go back to 5,000. How about 5,500? 6,000. We did lose a little bit of speed, but not a whole lot. So THD, mostly unchanged, 21%, and the sine wave looks pretty much the same. So yeah, the engine definitely healthier than the last machine we tried. Anyway, I don't want to push my luck. You know, that generator's not rated for 6,000 watts, so we're going to take the load off, let things cool down, and then we'll shut it down. All right, guys, and that is pretty much a wrap. So we chose the two worst of the four and got them back up and running and making power again. So maybe in a week or two, we'll take a look at the others. You know, hopefully they're not quite as bad as these were. You know, the GP 5000, that engine, although it ran, you could tell the bearings were shot. But thankfully, this engine that we put in there with the Amazon head had no issues at all reaching its rated load of 5,000 watts, and actually had no issues holding an overload of 6,000 watts, which is more than I can say for the OEM engine. You know, this one clearly was not maintained well. There is a lot of varnish in the engine, but the good news is the repaired rotor held, and the engine, although not performing great, you know, I don't think it's down on horsepower. You know, I forgot to bump the throttle, but the reason why I say that is because the initial load of 2,000 watts really slowed this engine down quite a bit, whereas it didn't over here. So I think it is a governor sensitivity issue, and likely just some varnish buildup on the governor kind of throwing things out of whack. So potentially a little bit of maintenance and some hours on this machine might improve things. But either way, you know, these machines were essentially useless when we started, and now they are back up and running and doing what they should. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.